Thank you, Kelsey.
And welcome. I'm Sarah, just so you know who's who. That's Stephanie. And, you know, when you first get a project, especially if it's a bid and you've won it and you find out you're the lead designer and you go, oh my gosh, what am I going to do about this project? And that's true with any software. So today we're going to go through kind of the background of the project scope, why we chose CET, because CET was new to our dealership at the time. I was like a 6 months user. And what did we do right? Because we've learned a lot of things on this project. You do 8,000 stations, you learn a few things. Then what did we learn? What would we do differently? We're also going to go through a little bit of some of the actual drawings and the blocks and what we did within CET.
So just a little bit of the background. So Sarah just mentioned she had only been using CET for about 6 months. Our dealership, our manufacturer, our primary manufacturer, had only launched their extension about 6 or 7 months before that. I actually came from a different dealership, a different manufacturer. So I had been using CET at the time about, I guess it was maybe 6 years or so. So I had the most experience using it. However, all of the other team members, and we ended up with a total of 4 designers working on this, all of the other team members had 6 months or less even. One of them actually joined our dealership during the process of the project, and so was getting trained on CET while she was starting working on this project. Now the project background itself, so the reason why we had to go through this process of even evaluating whether CET was a good fit for this project, we did not use CET for the bid process because the bid process actually took close to about 3 years. So we started the bid process before CET was even on the horizon for our dealership. So the entire bid process ended up being done in AutoCAD. And so once we actually won the project was when we started saying, okay, we have this many buildings, this many workstations, this many typicals, et cetera. How are we going to accomplish this? Now, one of the other things to note too, even though we did have CET at the time, the product line that we chose, or that we were using for this installation, was not yet in CET either. So we did have project symbols, thankfully, but we did not have a CET extension. So you're probably thinking, why? Everything is going against you for like, why would you even go into CET for this project? So the project scope itself.
We started off with like knowing that we had 5 buildings and 28 floors total. And there were primarily 2 or 3 typicals. And I think the other part of this and the background of it, neither of us were the bid designers. So that's why that initial thought is, oh my gosh, I'm the lead designer on this. And I was the only one on the team at that time and the person that worked on the bid, but I was told I was the lead designer. And my manager said, okay, this is the scope, this is the deal, you know, you have all these specials, it's been going for 3 years, and the typicals were not worked out quite yet. Like our final mock-up had 4 different leg types, none of which is what we ended up with. So if that gives the complexity. So it's big, you can see that there's different color schemes, each floor had its own color scheme, and it just took a lot of development, and it was just trying to think through, how do we want to do this? I'd done some big projects before, 1,200 stations, which is why I was assigned the project. But so I knew the organization. But anyway, this is where we started with knowing what was coming. And Now,
because of course, it became more complicated, as we all know projects tend to do as they morph and, oh, well, we really like this, and oh, we forgot about this space, and oh, can you also end up doing, X, Y, and Z? So we started out with knowing that we had about 4,000 to 5,000 workstations. To date, we have designed and specified 8,444 different workstations. Then they added filing and storage banks. Oh, and part of the ancillary. Fortunately, we didn't have all of the ancillary because we probably would have wanted it, we would be bald right now. But we did have a small portion of the ancillary. Plus, more buildings. We started out knowing that it was going to be 5 buildings. We are now up to 7 buildings.
I think so.
Yes. Plus, because we won the initial bid, we now also have won, by default, all of their remote locations. Now, to give a little bit more background to backtrack so that you understand the scope of these remote locations, this is a project for one of the major airlines here in the United States. So when we talk about remote locations, we're talking about offices that are in any given domestic airport. So, and all of those have a different set of standards from what we did for these primary headquarters buildings. So that means that we ended up with 10 different typicals, not including the remote locations. Yeah, only 10. Now, we're not talking how many different iterations of those typicals. Seven buildings with a total of 46 floors. At last count, we had 629 different specials and a total of 13 different color schemes. However, we are very proud to say that we managed to do all of that with 0 design errors on the workstations. Now, we did say workstations, right?
Yeah. So, like I said at the beginning, I was a student of Michael's and, over numerous trainings. And so I came definitely from AutoCAD, CAP, and the manager said, okay, it's your project. You can choose if you want to keep it in AutoCAD or you can, if you want to put it into CET. And this was before Stephanie had been added to the team and before we even knew more. So I had to think through, what did I really want to accomplish? So why did we choose it? So I had looked at heavily the different things with the stations as far as just within CET, the tools. So I took some of the simplified form of the basic typical of what I knew, and then I tested it out with definitely different blocks and playing with the blocks and trying to create master clusters, because the thing I'd learned on the 1,200 stations that I've done is that the real trick to a large project is to break it up and go, okay, the 10-pack is going to be used everywhere. And you don't want to check it every time. I mean, once you check it and have it perfect, you just want to reuse it, the whole 8,000 stations. And so I knew that's what I wanted to try to do, but I wasn't sure how to accomplish that in CET. So I spent a lot of time, I think I spent maybe 2 or 3 weeks going through CET with the blocks, the tagging, the favorites, the reusable files. Some of it was trying to learn how to use all of that because that wasn't in the basic training that the first introduction. And gradually I decided that, I think it would be better to be able to put this into CET because I love the visual of it and the rendering because that helps speed things up for the clients. And it would help with the team members because if you make everything, we made all the clusters favorites, and I knew that if we had a team of people, it would help us organize the project and be able to work on different things at different times. So after really thinking about it, I decided that between the favorites and the tagging and all the CET tools, that it was really going to be the better way to go in the long run, even though we already had a good chunk done in the beginning in AutoCAD. But my manager kind of looked at me like, are you sure about that? But and then she was like, what do you need from me? And she added Stephanie to the team. So what did we do right?
Yes, so we've decided to use CET. So we're in the middle of this maze. We have a little bit of light to lead us forward, but still, where are we gonna go with it? Well, you know, hindsight is always 20/20. So we did find that we did quite a bit right, fortunately. The first one being the team members were open to using CET. So yes, I had a lot of experience with it, so I was very comfortable with it. Not all of the other team members were, but their open-mindedness, their willingness to even learn it, to kind of take it to the next step or the next level after that intro to training was key. Also, Sarah took a lot of time to organize that kind of big picture before any drawing happened.
Prep work.
Yeah.
The prep work of organizing, like take a step back and organize the big project in your mind of how you want to name things, group things, is really essential to a large project.
Right. So even just in terms of like the file structure, we had a couple of things already in place from our dealership for like how to save things down, but not anything for a project of this size. So Sarah took a lot of time to really figure out the organization of everything, but even down to the naming of the favorites in our blocks. So this is an example of all of our different typical and the iterations of those typicals. So anyone on the team could look at these block names and know exactly what iteration of that typical that we are referring to without even having to look at a plan view or a rendering of it. Utilizing our resources. So we come from a Herman Miller dealership. They fortunately had put together kind of a CET team that we were open to tapping into. And we actually started out doing weekly calls with them and saying, okay, these are our stumbling blocks with your years and years of experience. One member of the team at the time had over 10 years of experience, and then while we were in this process, they added a new member to that Herman Miller team that had even more years of experience. So we were still able to tap into them and ask questions, say, okay, we're debating between doing this way or this way, which way would you recommend? They even had some suggestions that we hadn't even thought of yet for certain things. So that was key. We also tapped into our specials team over at Herman Miller. And I would say with any large project with even a third the number of, even less than that, 20% of the number of specials that we had, if we're talking still like 100 specials, tap into your manufacturer's specials team, ask if it's possible to get someone like dedicated to this project. The fact that we were able to have phone calls with 1 to 2 people from specials as well as engineering if we needed them was phenomenal and helped us through so many different issues that we were coming up with because of all of the details of like 1/16 of an inch here, 1/8 of an inch here. So, and then one of the suggestions actually came out of our weekly calls with our CET team was to also tap into Project Matrix. So I mentioned that we didn't have the CET extension when we started of the primary product line, but also given the number of specials that we had. Well, through the bid process, we actually already had, I think it was around 80 to 90 of the specials pretty much already drawn in CAD. So we went to Project Matrix and said, can you please make these into a catalog for us so that we can drop them in just like we do other project symbols in CET. and then it already has all of the special information attached to it. They said yes. We said, how much will it cost? Free.
There's a caveat to that.
There's a caveat that we'll get to on the learning. Yes, ... exactly. But know that that is an option or a resource. You know, talk to your non-manufacturer extensions to ask questions about how they might be able to help you. Now, our use of our favorites and blocks was enormous. We drew up all of our typicals. We drew up all of our cluster types within all of those different typicals. We double-checked them. We made them into blocks. We part tagged them. We made them into favorites so that everyone on the team could access them. Obviously, with 46 floors, we had to work on multiple floors at a time because we were actually ordering one building at a time as well. So being able to have the resources so that multiple people could be working in multiple drawings, but with the same information at the same time, became very key. So being able to use all of that. Now, again, kind of going back to the fact that our product line was not in CET at the beginning of this, the fact that we were able to also utilize the blocks and the favorites also became key for when that product line did come into CET. And this is just to give you, again, just a quick iteration of kind of what our different blocks and favorites ended up looking like within the drawings. So part tagging also, especially with a project of this size, you know, one of our tag fields, and I think that this is the same for at least some of the other manufacturers out there, will use one of the tag fields for their packaging and shipping. So working with our project manager to make sure that we were getting that information into that tag field the way that he needed it so that it would ship correctly. You know, we wanted to do that in CET, again, with those blocks and favorites so that we wouldn't have to do it on the back end with our specs every time. And then everything was obviously shipping direct to site because our warehouse is not large enough. I don't know of any warehouse large enough to accept this many stations at once. But then also, so that all of our renderings were pretty standard and looked very similar, no matter who was working on them. We did have a few kind of photo lab settings that we all used, really kind of looking at using a solid white background so that we weren't worrying about carpet and all of that. We did have a couple of post-processing shortcuts that we all installed and used so that like the filtering and everything would kind of look very similar as well. And then we also used a lot of the visibility clipping that's available in PhotoLab to really just help unify and focus on whichever cluster or workstation type that we were rendering at the time, and to help us just be more efficient with our time instead of having, I know that some people like to do freezing of all of their stuff before they go to render. We didn't have time to do that with this number of workstations in each floor. Then one of the other things that we decided to do, again, in order to have multiple people working in multiple drawings at the same time, we actually took separate, we're kind of calling them like quotable drawings. We separated those out, and I say quotable drawings, like your floors with all the different typicals that are on that floor. You know, you have everything drawn out so that then all you have to do in calculation view is say, export my CIF. Well, that's very different from actually drawing all of those typicals. So we separated those two things out. We had a separate drawing for our typicals. And what we actually ended up doing with those typicals too, because like what Sarah was saying, you know, many of these typicals were used on multiple floors. We didn't want to have to second check the same typical over and over 40 different times. So we second checked the clusters themselves before we took them into, saved them as favorites and took them into each floor drawing, which also actually ended up saving us some time when it came to install drawings, because then we could also do install drawings per cluster type one time and then send, just attach that for whatever floor that those appeared in for our PMs when it came for
You have
installs.
like a master set of cluster drawings, like that 10-pack, it's always going to be the same install drawing throughout.
Right.
You've already, so then Stephanie was just reorganizing the installs. I want to need this cluster one, this one, and so it saves time on the end.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah.
How did you deal with, the architecture? So there's, at least in the projects that I do, we'll run into a spot that has a column, and then this one pack that was a 10-pack is now like, a 9-pack, and one's like the printer station. Like, how did you deal with, the architecture and keeping those clusters standardized?
So I'm going to repeat the questions to make sure everyone can hear them. So the question is, how did we deal with architecture with things like columns where it might change a cluster type to kind of a one-off? Would that be accurate? Well, again, we would address those as they came up. And we essentially, because we already had a typicals drawing with all of our different cluster types in there, we would actually kind of go back to that drawing because it's easy to, copy and save with everything already done in the clusters that have already been second checked. To just then copy it over, make whatever changes that we need to, and then we can also, again, save it as a favorite because we don't know if it might actually be needed in another floor that we haven't received the architecture from.
Yeah, and I also tried to find things like that up front. So, because if you look at the base plan, one of the first things I do with the big project is print out the plans, and I start identifying, naming all the clusters, and then I go through and count how many are in each floor. And then so I'd like to try to find those up front. But then even though we had all the clusters checked, before we actually give over the specs, for the floor, all of it's back into the master floor plan. Right. So then you can double check that everything's fitting, that you didn't miss something. So,
Yep.
We have another question.
Two questions, not related. What systems in Miller were you using? And can you speak to the approval process between you and the client/architect?
So the questions are, what product line were we using in Herman Miller, and what was the approvals process with the client? So the product line that we were using in Herman Miller is called Canvas Channel, not to be confused with Hayworth Canvas that is CET. So there's two different things. And then how do we deal with approvals with the client? Our primary contact is actually with the architect. We did have weekly meetings, I think at that point, set up with us, the architect, and the small...
The real estate people.
Oh, yeah, the real estate people.
Yeah.
The end user, a couple of different people from the client side. And then also, I guess it's like a project management, like third party that was basically helping with like move coordination, because they were also bringing in some existing pieces. And then also the GC. So most of our direct contact with the client was happening at those weekly meetings, but those weekly meetings was only occurred for about the first 4 to 5 months that we were working on this. Since then, they have stopped happening, and at that point, most of our contact was directly with the architect then, and not with the client. So one more thing to just note on the typicals drawings that we did right. So when that CET extension finally did appear, and it did come out, I think it was about 4 or 5 months after we started working on this.
We were 2 buildings in.
Yes.
Just timeline.
So the fact that we had a separate drawing with all of the typicals drawn also ended up saving us time when it came time for that product line, because we just call it swapping. We were swapping out the symbols. So really what ended up happening was we only had to swap out all of the spines, all of our panel spines. We already had all of the component blocks done, so we didn't really have to do anything with those. It was just the panel systems that needed to be swapped out, which also made it easier. And I would say, I think at that point, we were up to, if I had to guess, probably about 50 different iterations of the typicals. And it took me, working on my own, just under a week to swap out, have them re-double checked to make sure I didn't miss anything. Some of it included having to make a few edit graphics on specials and, reattaching that special information and all that kind of thing. But so while I was doing that, the rest of the team was still able to move forward with other stuff. And then once I got everything second checked, that week-long process was also including me going into each floor that had already been drawn and replacing.
Then we started just swapping things out.
Yeah, so just replacing the blocks with all the new typicals, which that itself probably only took me like 2 days out of that week. So.
I have a question. So 2 questions. One question will be, how big is your CET file? Like how many workstations in one drawing? And the second question will be, when you combine project matrix with the extension symbols that already exist, did it make your CET like slow because of the size of the file, or how does CET react on that file?
Okay, so the first question, how many workstations per floor, roughly?
Roughly on your CET.
Yeah. So to answer that question,
It varied.
Yeah, so we actually, the first 5 buildings really had 3 different typicals with all of their iterations. And within those 3 typicals, each floor would have either 1 typical or 2 typicals. Rarely did any floor have all 3 typicals together. So 1 typical was a 7x7 workstation. And so those floors would have,
They were mostly around 200 stations.
yeah,
And that's the floor, like when we show you a floor plan, that's the typical.
Yeah.
That's the floor we show. Now, the Agile, the other typical,
yeah.
get
So
up close to what,
yeah,
350?
the other 2 typicals were primarily height adjustable tables with a pedestal. So there is much smaller floor print per workstation. And those, I would say, were probably closer to like 350 per floor. So speaking of,
How's like CET like? Is it like really slow, or is it like pretty fast? And because you have like combination of project matrix and extension details, I just want to know.
right, so with the AutoCAD backgrounds, because those files were still fairly large, even though after we cleaned them up in AutoCAD before importing them, I would say the average file size is over 20 megabytes each. So it did slow it down, but not significantly enough for us to feel like we weren't still being productive in it.
Yeah, because I could have several floors open at the same time and be fine. So. Good computer.
Alienware, yeah, this one's the Alienware. This one is an Alienware from Dell. So we wanted to just give you kind of an idea. This is one of the typicals, a file of our, with all the different iterations of that typical. And so just to kind of give you an example of our tagging that we used. So like our tag 3 right here is where we had all of the shipping and packaging information that our PM requested. So we did all of that tagging right here when we're doing our typicals. And then you can also see, we already have some things blocked out. And so this is the same document or file that I used to create the second check documents per cluster type, which then also ended up turning into, with a few modifications to our each cluster type. So each cluster type we created, a layout to do our second checks, and then we would also have an article view just with that cluster type. So the calculation views for this one are a little insane because we had so many different,
And it's like one for each cluster.
yeah. Yes, it is.
But we still, like we said, we know exactly what tab is what because we coded it.
Right. And so, some article views are for our second check, and then we also created basically kind of identical article views, but changed the layout of them specifically for our installation crew. So then when it came time for us to do installation drawings, it was actually pretty easy for me because there was a couple things I might have to like turn off and on. I added some labeling with specials that wasn't showing up during second check. And then really the only thing that I had to do was come into the article view and then just change which view that I was calling up for the installation versus the second check, and then print to PDF, and I had that cluster done for our installation crew, and I could send it off to them for however many floors that it occurred on. So the floor drawing
Yeah.
was a completely different animal.
Yeah, so that was mostly, Stephanie did more of the clusters and I did more of the big picture. And then, so we have all of the clusters in. This is, just so you can see kind of what the floor plan starts looking like with these typicals. So we populated everything, and I went through. Say, why didn't it refresh? It's been like popping up correctly every time we tested this. Figures, right? So what we did is I added, Stephanie was talking about the tagging. I used tag 2 for just workstations because we did have ancillary in there. We had filing in there. And I wanted to pull out just the workstations. So I tagged all the clusters with workstation and made this article view, and then we did the sift from this. And to make sure that everything went across right, especially once, I did this after we switched from the project symbols and the way we had to organize the first couple of buildings. I wanted to make sure that the cluster specs and that the math all came out right and that it all went back across. So I made a master spreadsheet. Like this is one building with each floor, and I have all the cluster names and the counts and what we had deemed the dollar amount. So I did that as a cross-check just to help make sure that we really got everything in there that we intended to, and that everything went back across the way you think. So the one thing you do have to make sure you're checking when you do that is you might have to do some math on the packaging, like receptacles. It's gonna, if you have a difference, it's gonna be divisible by probably receptacle packaging. And you go, okay, that's it. And then once you have that, then it's easy. And you think, okay, I'm ready to give this over to sales. And you don't have to recheck any of this. It's all there.
Yeah. So, there was a lot of work that went into the front end with the typicals, second checking the typicals and all of that. And I would say, we had the first buildings quotes due 3 months after we won the bid. And we still had to get specials created, do all of the drawing, working with Project Matrix, like all of that was happening in that 3-month period.
And
So-
the salesperson was getting nervous.
Yeah.
Because we're like, you haven't started drawing the
Yeah,
plans? It's like,
we didn't
trust
touch,
me.
we didn't touch the floors until I'd say the last 3 to 4 weeks, and he was seriously panicking, and we're like, no, we got this covered.
No, we have a plan. We
Yeah,
know.
but so we did all of this front end work, so that by the time we actually got to these floor drawings, though, it would take us 30 minutes to drop in all of the different
Yeah.
cluster types, and then, another couple hours to,
Yeah.
do the part tagging to get all the different article views for the workstations versus everything else and all that. But, like once we got to the actual floor drawings though, we weren't really spending that much time in the actual floor drawings because we had done all of this, back end, front end, however you want to classify it, work before we even got to this point. So once we actually started working on the floors themselves, things just went super
Yeah.
fast. And as
It's
my
worth-
my
it's
3-year-old son
worth
likes to
that
say, super fast
upfront.
like Superman.
Yeah.
So let's get back into here.
So what did we learn? We obviously learned a lot of things. And there it goes. This was the typical, it's like, so the new users learned how to use CET. I mean, I had done training, but there's nothing like the hands-on experience to figure that out. I had to learn how to dimension things and the paper space and, I mean, all of that, everything that was an AutoCAD equivalent, I hadn't had training on. So I had to go through and kind of, okay, I know it's here somewhere. And we learned that, and plus all those other things we've already talked about. And I think we also pushed the boundaries of CET for both of us. I mean, we were so determined to make everything work the way we wanted it to work that we kept asking, no, we want it to do this for us, because we'd done big projects. And so I knew I wanted it organized a certain way. That's where the help from Herman Miller really was great, because they could, if they didn't know, they knew where to go to help us. So that's why big projects always ask for help. I mean, those development of the catalogs, that definitely was something that was needed. This is a picture of the way the information had to go over to project symbols or to project matrix. The AutoCAD, all those symbols had to be put in a grid. I mean, that's where it was an enormous amount of work on our end because it was free. And we didn't know what we didn't know. There's some things that we probably should have asked more questions up front that
Especially when it came to the scope.
so when we took our step back and organized things, there were things that we probably should have asked more questions on what's coming more, like later. So that's one of the things we learned. So a project this big too, you want to make sure you keep a count of the totals of all of the typicals. You can see where we kept trying to add as things were coming online. Because what's going to happen is later they're going to want to add
Random stuff.
random markers for all of those screens. And so how many are there? And it's not like you can just go look at one order and look at that. This is like buildings. So it's really helpful to know that running tally of what you've done for each typical. And then because this was new, one of the things that we learned was to make sure that we shared with people, because we were in the process of, as we were developing everything, we were beginning the standards for our department. That, because we didn't
Specifically
have.
with CET.
Yeah, within CET, because we did not have any paper spaces. We didn't have anything. We didn't have dimension styles and how we wanted to do that. We didn't have any of that set up at the time that we did this. So we decided this is what we should do for this project, and then we shared with the rest of the team. And we've also started sharing with other people, other dealerships, and we're here.
So now's the time to step back and reflect. Because, we're still in the middle of that maze, and we can still see in every single direction now, especially now that we're here and not even a year ago. So what would we do differently? So this is probably the really big question. Well, ask more questions because, like Sarah said, when we got the very first building, we were told like, oh, this is typical for, you know, like these floors that you see here is typical for the layout of all the other buildings with the stations. Yet not true. No, not even close.
It's mostly the
So
file banks.
mainly the file banks, but you know, this list right here that you see is a list of how we originally thought that the quotes were going to be broken out into. So this is our first round of quoting, and this is what it has turned into.
Because first of all, in the beginning, we had named everything with the phase. Well, that changed like in
Yeah.
3 weeks into the project. And I already had started all the file
Mm-hmm.
structures and everything.
Yes, but also notice
cautious
though,
of that.
yeah, like, you know, Sarah mentioned markers. Yeah, towards the end, you know, we're specifying trash cans and coat hangers for the lockers that we did, which, by the way, coat hangers sounds like a simple thing. It's not. We actually had to do custom coat hangers too, yes. Yeah, because the one thing we didn't think about was the width or the depth and
We
the
had special lockers in the file banks.
yeah.
So
Yeah. So, and then also, you know, just looking into what our favorites and our, you know, all of our reusable files, our paper views, you know, as well as all of the favorites and how we kind of named things. You know, we ended up with a whole bunch of different agile heads down, typical, no typical, you know, because we didn't ask enough questions at the front end to say, okay, how typical are these typicals?
yeah.
And then again, you know, with the naming, we did a great job of naming and kind of figuring that out with the workstation typicals. The file banks were a different story. We were not prepared for the file banks. The file banks that was lateral files, these special lockers that Sarah mentioned, and then also storage cabinets. In every different combination that you can imagine, one-sided, double-sided,
Different width.
everything had to, or some of things had to have a file surround, some things didn't, depending on where they were
There were two
located.
colors. Yeah.
Two different colors for the file surrounds. So our naming was, you know, you can even see right here, depending on who started that particular floor, the naming changed. You know, this is like one floor, this is another floor, down here is a third floor. We did not tackle that well at all.
We tried to organize it, but the first person that started with the file banks started it with like FB1, FB2. And it's like, no, that's not going to work.
We don't know what that means.
So we tried to get it where it's like D was for the back-to-back, you know,
Mm-hmm.
L meant locker, F meant the file. We tried to organize it, but there's so many sizes, and we ended up with 2 different colors in the surrounds that
Yeah.
it got crazy.
Yes. So you have a question?
Yeah. If you were to do it again, would you have created like a spreadsheet to help like track your typical names, or like how did you guys track like all of these plus all of your favorites that you did?
Right. So the question, if we were to redo it again, or knowing what we know now to go back in time, how would we have done it differently? Would we do it with an Excel spreadsheet of some kind? That's actually a really great question that I haven't given any thought to.
Yeah, I'm trying to think. I don't know if I would do it that way. I think I would include more the finish and the complete size of the file bank. Because that's part of where we kind of lost control. It's like you look at this and you don't know if that has 30 wide files in it or 36 wide file banks or files or a mix. And that's
Yeah.
what, I think I would do it with the size and make sure that finishes in with it. Because then when you go to the favorites, I mean, we did organize the favorites where we have it, the 7x7 stations, the agile stations, you know, everything that was pertaining to those. The file banks are all together. But, and even the ancillary got put into favorites because it was similar from floor to floor. So I think it would be more that other crucial information in the top, or in that name.
So maybe something similar to these.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
we started adding some.
Yeah. That lovely project matrix custom catalog that we told you was free. Yeah. So project matrix themselves does not will not create the AutoCAD symbols, and there's an AutoCAD file, there's 2 different Excel files that all 3 cross-reference each other for them to be able to, poof it into their into their catalogs that you see on when you go to pull a part number out. They said that there are third-party vendors that will do that. At the time, the price that we were quoted was like probably around $125 an hour, and we were like, well, that's not what we charge, so it's got to be easier and faster if we just do it ourselves, because we already know like what's what, and we already have the symbols drawn, like not a big deal. I would probably recommend paying that third-party vendor because the number of hours, there's 2 designers, myself and the designer that started this on the bid process that had, he's our AutoCAD guru in the office. Between the 2 of us, I would probably, just guessing, 60 hours spent doing this, that, a third-party vendor that knows what they're doing, at least a third of the time, if not less. So that would be something that I would recommend. Yes, take advantage of it, but really look hard at where you want to spend your time within your department. And, could the department's time be spent better working on drawings versus paying that third-party vendor to do all of this kind of back-end stuff for you? Better address multi-floor requests. So we're getting to the point now where that initial building, or really the initial 5 buildings that we won the bid for, have installed. Once they started occupying the space, when we know that this happens. Why didn't we think of this? I don't know. So-and-so moves into their office. Oh, but I didn't get my pencil tray, and this person, this department moves in over here. Oh, we need, 2 more files, to fit all of our hard copy stuff. And it's not even just the punch list items. It's all these random requests that come in when they finally occupy the space. Well, we're talking floors at a time being occupied. And then add into that then you're talking about multiple buildings. So now we're at the point now where we're getting these requests for trash cans that, it's not just this floor that needs trash cans, it's all 5 buildings, all 8 floors per building that need trash cans. So we didn't look at, we did not look at how do we, with our fancy filing system that we had figured out, we'd figured it out by building by floor. We didn't figure out all at the same time. So, again, kind of just thinking through like what those day 1 orders versus the day 2 orders are going to look like. We've already done a couple of reconfigures where they're pulling product from one floor and moving it to a different floor. How do we do that in a way that whichever designer from the team happens to be working on it can find the information that they need, and then when someone else goes to go and second check it, that they can also find all the information in order to have everything that they need to second check it with, because it's in all these different locations now. So that being said, we did a lot right.
Yes.
We also learned a lot.
Yes.
So
What questions?
any questions?
We're going to go back to the days of doing like a 20-station project thing.
Do we go back to the days of doing 20-station workstation? Oh, yes, and we both have.
Yes, yeah. We're both starting to get other things mixed in.
Yes.
Because the status of all of these stations is that by the end of the year, I think everything's going to be installed. So we're pretty close. We're done specifying the core part of the project. So,
Yes.
So when you first started this project, of course, we were working with project matrix because Hermelo didn't have extension. Now that the extension is in and you can do a special, favorite symbols, blah, blah, are you guys still attached to that other routine or you guys are now developing everything to CET? No switching from project matrix into, no bringing anything from project matrix?
So I want to make sure I'm understanding the question correctly. So are we still bringing in project matrix symbols for this project? Through the specials versus bringing them in through the CET symbols and then making them into specials? For this project in particular, I mean, like Sarah said, we've pretty much specified everything. At this point, it's mainly if we have like these small additions or reconfigures that we're already dealing with. And really it depends on what the special is. If it's like we ended up having a special power module symbol, with that, yeah, we'll bring it in through project symbols because it's already, all the information's already there. All we have to do is just plop in the symbol. If we're talking about like one of the special panel tiles, well, we want to bring in the panel through CET symbols. So then, yes, we will end up making that tile, the CET symbol, into a special so that we still have everything else that goes with that panel through CET. So it's a combination of the two.
yeah, and you have to remember, we have all those reusable files and favorites, so you can bring it in, and then if you need to change it, then it's easier to change. You know, I mean, you can clone your block and you have something new. I think for project, I want to say too, on this, there's so many specials that were made for us, and there's some things that are unique to this project. Because we have them, and our salespeople are actually proposing a few things from this to other clients. So then I will pull it in from the project symbols. If it hits another project, it's a conceptual idea.
So I think we only have enough time for a couple more questions.
Do you guys live, like, when you're done, okay, I've drawn all the things ready, straight to set the order, or are you jumping through 2020/project spec to order?
So are we exporting the SIF and putting it directly into order, or are we exporting it out to and taking it into a third party before we place the order? We are still doing the third party.
And if
Yeah.
so, do you touch it at all once it's there? Like, do you have to do any adjusting once you're into the third party, or is it?
Do we have to do any adjusting once we get into the third party? We do, but it's been fairly minimal.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was, well, we added color coding. Some of it was the generic column. We'd have to add, like, at one point, the generic column with the discount code was dropping off in the specials, so we'd have to go back and add that.
Right, which is
I
what
mean, that was, but that
for our,
later
yeah,
got fixed.
for us, the generic column is where our salesperson finds their discount code. So, and then I would say it's also mainly with things like the packaging for like receptacles and ganging hardware. You know, things that come packaged together that we want to make sure that that has been calculated correctly.
What made you choose between like blocks and favorites? Like I usually use favorites kind of solely, but like what gravitates you towards either one?
So why did we choose to use blocks versus favorites?
Or like, because you use both, right? So like which one, when do you gravitate towards?
So at least for me, I would say my rule of thumb with that, if I know that a block is going to be used multiple times within one drawing, I'm going to block it out so that I don't have to redraw multiple times should something change. Favorites is more if it's going to be reused outside of that drawing. And in this case, we had both scenarios, so we used both in conjunction with each other.
I would agree with that. And, you know, one of the things I don't think you really pointed out in that master cluster drawing, there were blocks and blocks. So like all the left-handed components were blocked together and all the
Yeah.
right-hand components were blocked together. So even if something changed, say on the 7x7s, if you wanted to go, you only had to go into the left-hand block and the right-hand block, and it changed all the master stations.
Yeah,
You just
so-
had to do it once.
Yeah, definitely those component blocks within blocks is also very key.
And then we blocked all of that together.
Exception.
Yeah. Yes, it's for a major airline. Yeah, so here's the irony for me. So our office, our dealership is located in the Dallas-Fort Worth metro area. So you can actually probably narrow down which airlines this possibly is. My husband actually got a new job in Georgia last year, so I've actually been working remotely out of Georgia for the last 15 months, which means that I fly in and out of Atlanta. I can count on one hand the number of times that I have flown on this particular airline and going back and forth to the office. So yeah, the irony for me yesterday was sitting in the Atlanta airport, which is a hub for Delta. I was not flying Delta. I was also not flying this airline, but I'm sitting here at the gate for another airline, answering emails for this airline, in the middle of a hub for a third airline. I mean, it was, yeah.
Meanwhile, I
So-
flew this airline here.
But no free tickets. Not for us, at least.
No.
How did you decide amongst your team members who gets divided, what responsibilities? Like, how did you divide and conquer that?
How did we decide who of the design team was doing what? I'll let you answer that one.
I tried to play to everyone's strengths because mine obviously was the big picture. Stephanie's was more the detail and getting the clusters together. The person who did the bid, his specialty is specials and working out. I mean, he has like an engineering mind almost, and he will think through to that 1/16th inch of if this is going to work or no, that's a conflict. And so I think that's part of why he was on the project to begin with. And then the other person that got added primarily took ancillary. So it really ended up with a flow of the, like the step one and organizing that and the typicals and the stations, in which, I mean, we all had a hand in that in the beginning. But then I took on the big, trying to pull the floors together. And the person who did the bid did the most of the double checking because he was familiar with what was supposed to go into the project too. So, I mean, once we got into a flow, it just kind of kept going. But it did take 4 of us to handle this. So,
So I think we have 1 minute left. If there's, okay, one more question.
Why did
Less than a
you
minute.
use a different article view for everything when you can filter out your zip and just zip out whichever block you want?
Are you,
In your calculation, you had a different article view for like every typical, didn't you?
so why do we use different article views for each typical? So
Rather than just one, and then you filter out and zip out whichever one you were working with.
right. So when we were doing it by floor, we were just doing basically like workstations versus filing versus ancillary, I think, because those were going to be on different orders so that we could group those together. On the typicals file, where we had it by cluster type, that was mainly for creating our second check and installation drawings.
and I think it was easier, maybe it's a little bit of old school, it's easier for me to actually see if I know I have all the workstations and I know I have 45 whips or 217 workstations. You could glance at that article view and go, yes, it got what I wanted, and then you can sift it. I mean, rather than sifting it out, putting it into other third-party software and then checking, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that does.
I like trying to keep as much in CET as possible up front. I mean, that's,
Never done it that way, so I was just
Yeah.
curious.
And we all got to the Goblet of Fire. Yay!